A war that was supposed to stay over there is now being felt in two directions at once. Russia is stepping up UAV and missile attacks to apply strategic pressure on Ukraine. And the targets are not only troops but also energy infrastructure and civilian morale, even as quiet diplomatic talks continue in the background. Ukraine is responding with long-range UAV strikes deep inside Russia, and reports have pointed to hits in the Veliky Novgorod area, including the Akron chemical plant, where fires and disruptions were recorded. At the same time, Moscow's airspace and nearby corridors have faced temporary flight restrictions because of UAV threats, and that has pushed delays and cancellations across major airports like Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, and Vnukovo, leaving passengers stuck in scenes rarely associated with Russia's capital. Then, the psychological line broke, because explosions, air defense warnings, and falling drone debris brought the war into residential areas near the center of power, even if some claims of total paralysis are clearly told with exaggeration. For clear reporting on weapons, real battles, and the politics behind them, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force. Russia's current escalation is built to squeeze Ukraine through the systems that keep daily life running, not only through clashes at the front. The main targets are power lines, substations, and other urban choke points, because a short outage can ripple into transport, heating, water pumps, and basic services. That ripple matters in a modern city, because fear grows faster when people cannot predict what will work in the morning. A missile that hits a trench may change one block of ground, but a strike that knocks out electricity can change how millions think and sleep. This is why energy infrastructure becomes a strategic lever, since it can turn normal routines into constant planning and constant stress. And that stress is the doorway into the political layer of the war. Even when leaders talk in back rooms, the battlefield is still shaping the mood outside those rooms. When the lights flicker and sirens become normal, patience drops, tempers rise, and the space for calm decisions gets smaller. That is the bridge between a power station and a negotiation table. And it sets the tone for the kind of response Ukraine feels forced to consider. Russia also uses scale and repetition to make the pressure feel endless, even if every single strike does not land. Large volleys of drones and missiles create a rhythm where alerts become a daily soundtrack, so the public starts to measure life in quiet hours between warnings. The goal is not only physical damage because physical repairs can be done, but mental fatigue is harder to fix. When diplomatic channels stay open, pressure on infrastructure can feel like a message aimed at both Kyiv and foreign capitals watching closely. It signals that the war can be widened or narrowed, depending on concessions, timing, and outside support. In that frame, every blackout becomes a talking point, and every repair becomes a countdown to the next wave. This is also where information warfare slips in, because dramatic language can be used to sell a simple story that Ukraine cannot hold, and that compromise is the only path left. That story is not always backed by clear facts, but it can still spread when people are tired and services feel fragile. So the strikes do double duty, because they hit hardware in the street and they hit belief in the future. And once belief starts to bend, decision makers feel a different kind of weight on their shoulders. The deeper logic is that will is treated like an infrastructure node because it can be stressed, damaged, and exploited. That is why the transcript's framing focuses on civilian morale, since morale can shape recruitment, work discipline, and support for long war policies. If families think winter will be colder, or paychecks will be delayed, or hospitals will struggle, then the war stops being an abstract national cause and becomes a personal emergency. This is where a state hopes citizens will pressure leaders to accept worse terms just to regain stability. It is a hard calculation because it tries to trade public comfort for strategic advantage, and it treats hardship as a tool. At the same time, it invites a dangerous rebound because people under siege also harden, and a battered society can choose resistance over surrender. That tension is the reason this phase is so risky, because it can either break resolve or strengthen it, depending on how far the pain goes. And that uncertainty is exactly what pushes the war toward the next move in the sky. Ukraine's long-range UAV response is designed to prove that Russia's rear areas are not a safe zone, because a deep strike can force Moscow to defend its own territory instead of focusing only on the front. That matters because the message is not just a drone can reach far, it is distance no longer guarantees calm. When a state has to protect cities, industry, and transport routes at home, it starts splitting attention, and every split creates a new weakness. This is why long-range UAVs have become a strategic tool, even when the physical damage looks limited on a map. That logic becomes clearer when the reported target is not a trench, but a site tied to national output and supply chains. And that is where Veliky Novgorod enters the story. Reports have pointed to incidents in the Veliky Novgorod area linked to the Akron industrial complex, with fire activity and disruption described in international coverage. A major chemical and fertilizer producer is not a symbolic target because it sits inside a wider web of rail deliveries, storage, workers, and continuous production schedules. When a plant like that is interrupted, the cost is not only the burnt section, because downtime spreads into shipping delays, repair crews, safety checks, and nervous local authorities. In modern industry, even a short pause can push a backlog that takes days to unwind, especially when managers must prove the site is stable before restarts. And that is the kind of pressure that travels upward, because it pulls in regional leaders, emergency services, and national messaging teams, which then tightens the political stakes. The key point is that Ukraine does not need to destroy everything to change behavior, because the threat of repeat visits can reshape how Russia allocates air defense and internal security. That pressure also touches the question of what these facilities represent in wartime. Some reporting notes that Akron produces chemical products, including ammonium nitrate, which is widely used in civilian agriculture, yet it is also a material that can be tied to explosive supply chains in certain contexts. This is why analysts describe some industrial targets as dual use, because the same output can support normal markets and also feed wartime production lines through intermediaries. That does not automatically mean every bag of product becomes a weapon, but it does explain why a strike on chemical capacity can be read as a hit on economic endurance. If the aim is to slow the enemy's ability to sustain long campaigns, then disrupting nodes that support transport, energy, and industrial rhythm can be as important as hitting vehicles. So the real effect is often indirect, because uncertainty forces extra security layers, and extra layers raise costs across the board. There is also a signaling layer aimed at audiences beyond Russia. When international media reports a deep strike, it sends a line to partners watching the war, because it suggests Ukraine can still reach back and impose risk on Russian territory. That can shape diplomacy, since bargaining power is not only about land held, but also about the ability to impose future pain if talks fail. A credible long-range threat can protect Ukraine from being treated as a side that must accept terms simply to stop suffering, because it shows that escalation has a price for both sides. And once that idea takes hold, the conflict stops looking like a one-way pressure campaign and starts looking like a contest over who can endure strategic shock longer. That is the bridge from a single industrial fire to the larger fight over leverage, because one strike is an event, but the fear of the next strike is a strategy. Moscow's flight restrictions show how a drone threat can hit a capital without striking the Kremlin itself. When UAV warnings appear, Russian authorities often react by tightening or freezing civilian flight corridors, because a single uncertain track near approach routes can turn passenger safety into a political liability. That close the sky, then reopen it routine sounds simple, yet it exposes how sensitive the capital is to disruption, since air travel is one of the fastest ways a city measures normal life. Even a brief suspension forces instant decisions by airlines, controllers, and security services, and those decisions carry public costs that cannot be hidden. So the airspace response becomes part of the battlefield, even before any wreckage is shown. The pressure becomes visible inside the terminals, because crowds gather faster than any official statement can calm them. Reports described heavy delays and cancellations across Moscow's main hubs, with passengers stuck at Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, and Vnukovo. and some accounts also included Zhukovsky as disruption spread. In the transcripts telling, screens filled with red canceled lines, waiting areas ran out of seats, and people sat on floors or used coats like blankets, which is a small detail that signals a much bigger collapse of routine. The scene matters because Moscow is built on predictability, and predictability breaks when a normal trip turns into an overnight problem. That human congestion is where a technical threat turns into a social moment. Aviation limits also create a hard chain reaction because every grounded aircraft blocks gates, baggage systems, and crew schedules. When departures slip, arrivals cannot park, and once parking fills, planes hold in the air or divert, which spreads stress into regions that were not the original focus. The transcript claims the closure window reached up to 7 hours, and that more than 400 flights were canceled nationwide, including over 170 in Moscow. And those numbers matter because they show scale rather than a minor delay. In one night, transport becomes a headline, and headlines become pressure on officials who must look in control. That is why airports become a strategic stage. The deeper value of this kind of disruption is that it forces the state to act in public, and public action leaves traces. A missile strike can be censored, yet flight boards, traffic jams, and packed terminals are witnessed by thousands with phones, and those images travel on their own. When people are told everything is stable while they are trapped in a terminal for hours, trust erodes through lived experience, not through political speeches. That gap between message and reality is exactly what psychological warfare tries to widen. And once the gap opens, rumor becomes faster than policy. This is why the Moscow Air Corridor story matters beyond aviation, because it shows how modern conflict attacks the connectors of city life. A capital does not need to be conquered to be shaken, since the target can be confidence, coordination, and the feeling that the state controls its own space. When flight restrictions spread from the center to other routes, it signals that the defensive posture is being stretched, and stretching always creates new seams. Those seams are what the next wave of strategy looks for, which is why this airport chaos leads directly into the wider question of fear inside the home front. The real shock in Moscow was not only what burned, but what people felt in their own neighborhoods. When explosions are heard close enough to shake windows, and when air defense warnings cut through normal city noise, a distant war stops being a TV story and starts feeling like a personal risk. That change matters more than a crater, because it attacks the belief that the capital is protected by default. In a power-centered system, that belief is part of the state's authority, so any crack in it spreads faster than smoke. And once fear becomes real, people begin to watch the sky the way soldiers do. This is where debris becomes more than debris. A UAV that is shot down can still scatter fragments, and fragments falling near homes can create a second wave of panic, because citizens do not measure danger in technical terms like intercept rates. They measure danger by what lands near a school, a parked car, or an apartment block. Even if damage is limited, the feeling of randomness is what unsettles, since nobody can predict which street will be unlucky. That unpredictability is a weapon, because it turns ordinary life into a series of small alerts. Some stories describe Moscow as locked down or fully paralyzed, yet that language often belongs to persuasion, not measurement. A responsible reading separates confirmed disruptions from dramatic framing, because exaggeration can hide what is truly important. The important part is not that the city stopped, but that the city had to behave like a threatened zone, even for a short time. A few hours of uncertainty can be enough to change how people talk, what they trust, and what they expect from their leaders. And that is why psychological effects can exceed physical effects. The airport scenes described earlier feed directly into this mood, because stranded crowds turn stress into a public event. When passengers sleep on floors, when loudspeaker messages repeat without clarity, and when timelines keep shifting, rumor fills the gaps that officials leave behind. Phones start recording, chats light up, and every shaky clip becomes a new truth before any formal report arrives. That is how a drone threat can expand in the mind, because the information space is as exposed as the airspace. And once the information space is exposed, control becomes harder. This also pressures the state's narrative, because Moscow is used as a symbol of competence and order. If people see confusion in the capital, they will ask what smaller cities should expect. And that question is dangerous in a society built on top-down assurance. Even if authorities restore normal schedules quickly, the memory of that night stays, because it is linked to a basic instinct: safety at home. That is why the phrase, "war came to the home front," is powerful, even when it is spoken in a loud tone. The point is not to accept every dramatic claim, but to see what those claims are trying to highlight. They are highlighting a psychological boundary being crossed. Once that boundary is crossed, every future alert feels more believable, and every new restriction feels less temporary. That is how pressure accumulates without a ground advance, and it is why the mood inside Moscow becomes part of the wider strategic picture. And when fear becomes a factor inside the capital, the conflict starts to reshape decisions at the very top. Long-range UAV strikes matter most because they break the untouchable capital feeling. And even a small number getting through can force Moscow to spread air defense across too many directions at once. A capital is not defended like a single bunker, because it is defended like a network of corridors, radar arcs, and reaction teams that must choose what to cover first. When drones keep showing up in different places, the defenders have to shift units, change alert cycles, and keep more systems on standby. And that burns time and attention as much as it burns fuel. The real cost is not only what gets hit, because the real cost is what must be protected after the hit. That is how a low-cost threat can push a high-cost posture, and that posture creates gaps somewhere else. And those gaps are exactly what this kind of strategy is designed to create. The pressure becomes sharper when the same air defense pool is also needed near the front, because protection is a limited resource that cannot be in two places at full strength. If more assets are kept near Moscow and other key cities, then fewer assets can support forces closer to the fighting, and that changes how confident commanders feel about moving supplies or staging attacks. If more assets stay forward, then the home front accepts more risk, and the state must explain why security looks weaker than people were promised. Either choice has a price, and the point of the UAV campaign is to make that price show up every week, not once. That is why the strike is strategic, because it forces trade-offs that do not have clean answers. And once trade-offs start, the battlefield begins to reach into the decision room. In the political and diplomatic layer, deep strikes also work as a signal that Ukraine can still impose serious costs, so it will not walk into talks as a side that can only absorb punishment. A negotiation is never only about maps, because it is also about what happens if the negotiation fails. If one side looks unable to respond, then outside actors start pushing that side toward quick concessions, and opponents start raising demands because they smell weakness. That is why Ukraine has an incentive to show reach and persistence, since it changes how partners, rivals, and neutral countries judge its leverage. As some coverage has framed it, the message is simple: pressure can travel both ways, and any deal must account for that. This is not about pride, because pride does not stop missiles, but leverage can shape what terms are even possible. And once leverage becomes the focus, every strike is also a communication act. When the war touches civilian space inside Russia, it hits something more fragile than concrete, which is the public belief that the state can guarantee normal life. Many people can accept sacrifice when the danger feels distant, but the mood changes when danger feels local, and local fear changes what people demand from leaders. A night of alerts is not the same as a collapse, yet it can still chip away at the "we are protected" story that holds a system together. This is why long-range UAVs can have impact beyond their warhead size, because they can disturb work schedules, shake investor confidence, stress regional officials, and drive security spending upward across the country. The strike can be cleaned up, but the memory stays, and the memory becomes a factor in politics, media control, and elite debates about what comes next. That is the strategic upgrade, because UAVs stop being only battlefield tools and start acting like instruments that can reach into economics, psychology, and national planning at the same time. And when a weapon can do that, the conflict stops being only about territory and becomes a contest over whose system bends first under sustained pressure. This conflict is shifting from front lines to pressure points because power grids, airports, industrial sites, and the feeling of safety now carry strategic weight. If Russia keeps using infrastructure strikes to squeeze Ukraine's society, then Ukraine will keep pushing long-range UAV raids to make Russia pay at home, and the cycle can feed itself through fear, anger, and the need to respond. The bigger question is not who fires more, because volume is only noise if it does not change choices. The real question is who can control tempo and trade-offs, since Moscow must defend key cities without draining the front, while Kyiv must keep deep strikes credible without exhausting its own resources. This is also a battle over attention, because every air alert pulls air defense, repair crews, and political focus away from other goals, and that friction adds up over time. If the Kremlin spends more to protect the capital, gaps can open elsewhere. Yet if it accepts risk at home, public confidence can erode faster than any official message can repair. And if Ukraine can show reach without overpromising, it can enter any negotiation with fewer hard limits on its options. For more clear reporting on weapons, real battles, and the politics behind them, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force.